Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras, A Changing America. I'm Monica Ortiz Uribe. So many of us here on the border, myself included, juggle a dual identity, part Mexican, part American. Sometimes one identity is stronger than the other, but the great thing about the border is you don't have to choose. You can be both. My guest today struggled with his own dual identity, an experience he shares in his first book titled Midnight in Mexico. Alfredo Corchado is the Mexico City correspondent for the Dallas Morning News. He's also a dear friend, a wise mentor, and a great reporter. Welcome, Alfredo.
It's my pleasure to be here. I'm not sure about wise mentor. It makes me feel so old, but I'll take it.
It's the truth. It's the truth. I appreciate every bit of advice. All right. So tell us about this identity crisis that you struggle with in your book. Why was it such a dilemma?
Well, imagine the Dallas Morning News naming you foreign correspondent, and you're celebrating. You think, am I a foreign correspondent? I mean, I was born in Mexico, lived the first 6 years of my life in Mexico, and suddenly you're a foreign correspondent. And I feel like Mexico is very personal, but I think you really get into the whole issue of rejection. I think you find a bit of rejection on both sides of the border because you're an American working in Mexico, or because you're a Mexican in the United States. It's almost like they love who you are. They love your food, your music, maybe what you represent, but they're not really crazy about you. And I think you can say the same thing in Mexico. I think the way I've dealt with this, I'm not sure I'd call it a crisis. I mean, I think it's been a challenge, but it also makes you realize the value of two, the value of speaking two languages, the value of understanding two cultures, and trying to be a bridge, if you will, between the two. So I often tell my younger nephews and nieces, instead of feeling less than one, let's strive to feel more than two. And I think that's really the best way to handle that dilemma or crisis.
Okay, so you've come to terms with it, and you figure
I've come to terms with the fact that there are 35 million Americans who trace their roots in Mexico. And I think just about every community in Mexico has someone in the United States. So at the end, I think you come to the conclusion that you don't have to choose anymore. You are who you are. You don't have to choose anymore. It's there. And I think Mexicans have made a lot of progress from the time I arrived in Mexico in 1994 to stay. We went from the whole pocho dilemma,
which is
the pocho is the Mexican American who doesn't speak the language correctly, who doesn't do the chilango, the polanco, the lomas, the rhythm. But I think these days, I mean, you get a sense of where Mexico is by you walk just about every neighborhood in Mexico City, and there's a Starbucks, or there's some kind of U.S. franchise, and you're listening to English. So I think we're slowly becoming a lot less nationalistic and much more embracing of the outsider. In some levels, I think it's even much more than Americans can say about themselves. I think Mexicans are probably a little more welcoming than a lot of Americans, at least if you judge it by the debates on immigration reform.
All right, well, let's talk about the book. You started off with one of the more dramatic moments in your career, which was a death threat that you received. So take us back to that moment. Why were you threatened, and what was it like getting the news?
It was July 2007. We had just done a big story in the Dallas Morning News describing an ongoing efforts to do a pact between organized crime and the government, or members of the government. And I think I learned quickly that, I had been writing about organized crime for a few years at that point. And there were some signs that, people weren't happy with your reporting, you were making people uncomfortable. But when a U.S. source, someone you trust, someone has been there for a while, calls you up and says, there are 3 names, and I think it's you, I get out. I mean, you take it much more seriously, and you realize that drug cartels do not like when you follow the money, whoever they are. I mean, I think the interesting thing for me was questioning whether these were cartels or these were members of the government. I mean, who was actually behind the threat? So at that moment, I felt frozen. I felt shocked, and I felt scared, and I wasn't sure what to do next. You know.
Yeah, so that death threat catapults us into the rest of the story, where you actually try to verify and even identify the source of the threat, right? Most people, if they were to receive a threat like that, they'd take off running, right? But you decided to stay. Why?
I had in the past, you know, I had done exactly that. I had run away, but again, it comes from a trusted source. That I thought, if these guys are really that serious, and they cannot get me because all of a sudden I leave Mexico, will they go after a loved one? Will they go after a relative of mine? Will they go after a friend of mine? You know, looking back, yeah, maybe I should have left immediately. But I think at that moment, you're living the moment, and you're thinking to yourself, how valid is this? How serious is this? And I kept asking people, just give me a few days. Give me a few days to find out. Let me make some phone calls. Let me talk to as many people as I can. And that's what I ended up doing. You know, just I think as a journalist covering organized crime, you just talk and talk and talk to as many people, because in the end, who do you trust? You know, you just keep talking.
So tell us more about what exactly you were covering and what got you to this point.
Well, you know, it's funny. When I went to Mexico, I had promised my parents that I would not cover drug trafficking. So I was covering just about everything but drug trafficking or organized crime. But I think when the PRI ended its reign, this is the Institution Revolutionary Party, which had governed Mexico for 71 years. After they were kicked out of power, you saw the dramatic shift. You saw the power go from the central, you know, Mexico City, and it was centralized power, to all of a sudden the states had the power. So people, members of organized, had to suddenly negotiate with the states. And I think that's when we saw kind of the monster coming, or the genie coming out of the bottle, and you could not ignore that. I mean, we had a bureau at one point at Dallas Morning News of 12 people, and Below TV, Angela Cucharga was the bureau chief. So suddenly you are one person, and you're covering that, and you cannot ignore that story.
So your staff was reduced, which is where
it was reduced over time, you know, from 12 to 7 to 5, and all of a sudden you don't have the luxury of saying, let me cover immigration, or let me cover the latest U.S. policy to Cuba or Mexico. I mean, suddenly you are that person, and you're thrust into that. But also, I think it was like I had to find my own, answer my own questions, you know, which was, it's something that I posed at the beginning of the book, you know, my mother asking me, why would you want to go back to Mexico? We took you out of Mexico. So it's almost like you have to answer that question, why am I here? And I think at the beginning of the book, I set that journey, you know, throughout the book, you know, trying to answer my mother's question.
And so tell us, why did you said you were born in Mexico and you lived part of your childhood there, then you came to the United States. Why did your mother tell you that? Why did she bring you all back? Why did she bring you to the United States?
My father was a bracero, and we had the choice, or the luxury, my dad did, of making us legal. So he gave us green cards. And my mother felt that it was important. We had a family tragedy. It was important to reunite with my father, make sure that we knew we had a father figure. Because, you know, as a kid growing up, I didn't even know I had a father. I knew there was a man who would come from California, the Central Valley, stop in El Paso, go to Tony Lama's, buy boots, and then he would show up, and it was like, there's a strange man every Christmas, you know, with little boots. So my mother wanted to make sure that we had a father figure. And that's why we left, worked in the San Joaquin Valley at the beginning. My parents were members of the Cesar Chavez Union, the United Farm Workers. And so we worked the fields. I mean, we were mostly farm workers as children.
So the bracero program was a temporary worker program for Mexican laborers.
Exactly,
to come.
and it was interesting because it was in the early 60s when the program was coming to an end that workers had the choice. Do we stay in the United States or do we go back to Mexico? Because they couldn't go back and forth like they used to. It wasn't as easy. And my family decided that the United States was a place that we needed to be, and this was a place for opportunity, for possibility. My mother always felt like the energy of Mexico was sucked away, and that more and more the energy was on this side of the border.
And did that turn out to be the case? Was it worth it?
Obviously, I mean, you look back and, I mean, what better way than to go back to Mexico than to go back on your own terms and to go back earning dollars, if you will. You are, it's your choice. I mean, you don't have to go back. So yeah, there were many times when I started off in Mexico. I lived in this beautiful neighborhood called Coyoacán.
Where Frida Kahlo.
Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera. We had, I mean, they were just blocks from my house. I would often think, wow, had I not gone to the United States, I would never have this opportunity to rub elbows with some of Mexico's elite, or the privilege, if you will. So yeah, I mean, it was clear that my mother was right about that the opportunities, the possibilities were on this side of the border.
And why did you choose reporting as a profession?
Long story short, I was actually working in the fields one day, and these TA reporters, not very different from you, very curious, they want to know more and more. And they asked me the question, what's it like working in the fields without water, without sanitation? And suddenly you are answering that question, and it clicks. Wow, someone wants to give me a voice. So that, I think, and it's not that at that moment I wanted to be a reporter, because I'd be lying if I said I did. But I think it was something that stuck in my head, where when the opportunity came, and it was, do you want to be a reporter, a foreign correspondent? I thought, what does that mean? They said, well, you live in a foreign country and they pay you. And that's when I thought, wow, someone would actually pay me to go back to Mexico. And that's really how it all started.
Very good. So one of the things that that fascinated me about your book is how much of your personal story led into the stories you told as a professional, and so like there was an instance where you talk about your parents' restaurant, Freddy's Cafe, which was just four blocks from the International Bridge
Right.
in El Paso, and so you worked there as a server. And I want to read a passage from the book that describes this cafe. So it goes this way. During the week, our favorite customers were named Chano, Perica, Pilín, Neto, Memo, Botas, Chapulín, Chiquillín. Chiquillín. Their nicknames referred to parrots, grasshoppers, boots, and other objects. No one ever really gave a real name. No one asked. We weren't curious. The men and women roamed South El Paso Street, hustling on a street that seemed like an extension of Juarez, crammed with vendors of cheap goods, t-shirts, lipstick, and other trinkets. They would trust us with packages for a few hours. On the border, it was best to keep our mouths shut about what we saw and heard. So, first of all, what were these packages, and why did your family agree to hold on to them?
Well, like I said, I mean, we never asked. I think we were all, again, this is a family that grew up in California. We didn't really understand the whole dynamic, but we knew enough not to ask too many questions. And when people said, not mi nombre es Mónica, my name is Mónica, but my name is Bella, it was like a nod and a wink. Okay, I get it. And they leave packages, and we just thought, okay, this is, we're not supposed to know. The less you know, the better. And I think that was really my parents' philosophy, especially my father. I mean, he just thought, no sean preguntones. And it was interesting, when I became a reporter, I found that a lot of my sources were really there. I didn't really have to go that far. I mean, they were there.
And we get to meet some of these sources as characters in your book. Can you tell us about some of them?
Yeah, I mean, there's one woman who I didn't really know her name at the time, and again, these are all nicknames. But when I saw her later, I said, haven't we met, or did we meet? And she was telling me a story about she had dropped a bottle once, and they found that there was cocaine packages, and I thought, well, I remember that. I remember one time we had a client, and something similar happened. We started looking at one another. But we never really, to this day, we've never really been able to admit that maybe we knew each other, yet we do know each other. And it's one of those weird things on the border, that the identities never really reveal. I mean, you're just there, you're kind of shadowy figures on both sides of the border. But she became a really good source, and has really, I think, taught me a lot about the underbelly of Mexico. In the book, she's known as Paisana.
So how did these sources inform you for your reports?
Well, they give you another side. I mean, especially when you work on the border, it's not enough to talk to officials on both sides of the border. You know, it's not enough to talk to the Mexican official, get that comment, or the person in D.C. or the person in El Paso, or Las Cruces. It's really about the people. And when you work and report on a shadowy existence, you have to just talk and talk and talk to as many people to try to get a sense of what the real story is.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's go back to that to the death threat that you got at the beginning. I mean, towards the end of the book, you actually find out who it was, right?
Do you really?
Well, I don't know. Can you tell us about that? Can you give us some insight?
I think it would be such a spoiler alert that I would ruin the book for a lot of people. I would urge people to read it, and I really don't know that we reveal the person behind. I think we give a lot more clarity to what happens, and it's really that whole search. You know, I don't know what else to say without ruining the book for readers. I mean, I'm sure there are people right now reading the book and thinking, "Please don't give it away. Please don't give it away."
So you're saying you got to pick it up and you got to find out for yourself. Okay.
This was a labor of love, and it took a lot of it. It was really heart and soul. So let's hope people that they read it.
So also in the book, you detail a lot of what goes wrong in Mexico, but you also talk about hope. So can you tell us what are Mexico's biggest challenges right now, and where do you see hope for the future?
You know, I think as a reporter in Mexico, oftentimes you're really covering 2, maybe 3 countries, and one of them is obviously the troubled, violent regions of Mexico, but it's also a more prosperous Mexico, in regions of Mexico like the central. You see people doing more, achieving more. There's more ambition. There's more education. You have the aerospace industry. You have the auto plant industries. And you have people who say, you know what, I do think about going to the United States like my parents did, but more out of curiosity than out of necessity. And that kind of points you to a different Mexico. You cannot get away from the violent Mexico because 100,000 people have either been killed or disappeared. And it's really in those horrible times, the worst of times in Mexico, that I've also seen the best of Mexicans. I think here on the border, Las Cruces, El Paso, we're always reminded of the massacre in Villa de Salvarca, and how people. I mean, I know you were there when we went.
Right. Just give us a brief description.
I mean, this is
happened.
the massacre that basically killed 15 innocent people who were they were at the right place, but the assassins got the wrong house, got the wrong identity, and shot more than 30. I think 15 ended up being killed. But I think that was a real turning point in Mexico. That was, I think, the ugliest, saddest moment for a lot of us. I'm sure for you too. And yet, people had the choice to leave, and many of them decided to stay and to build community. And I see that as it embodies a Mexican resilient spirit, the courage in them, and their hope. And so, you know, it really, this book takes you from some of the darkest moments to also, I hope, some of the brightest moments. And I think when you look at Mexico in the future, you think of Juarez as just one tiny, tiny example. Not that Juarez is perfect, not that Juarez is fine, but Juarez is getting better. And you see that community and you realize this is where the hope lies.
Well, yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that, because there are many people who live here on the border that haven't been back to Mexico or Ciudad Juarez in years, and they're wondering, well, is it time to go back? Is it safe? What would you say?
I would say, you know, I think the saddest part of the last 6-7 years is when you find not just Americans, but especially Mexicans who have fled, who say, I'm afraid to go back to Mexico. And that's when you know that organized crime is won, when they take that away from you. Is it safe to go back? You know, I think I have yet to find where tourists are the targets. I've seen where tourists have been caught in the crossfire. I always tell people, you know, my own family, my own friends, yes, go back, but just be careful, using a lot more common sense. For example, I live in El Paso. whenever I travel to Mexico City or Durango, I like to take my car and go through that area. I don't travel at night anymore. I try to stick to a plan. Leave at 6 o'clock in the morning. I mean, you just have to do things differently. But I think Mexico remains as beautiful as ever. I mean, come on, I challenge you to think of another beach that's more beautiful, or a colonial town that's more beautiful. I mean, it's there. So I would hate to tell people to stay away.
Very good. And so that brings me to my next question, is that your book does take place in large part in Mexico, but it also has an American component to it. So why should Americans read your book, and why should they care about Mexico?
It's a good question, because I think when I wrote this, it was very important for me to write it from both sides of the border. I often think of it as I wrote it with the heart of a Mexican and the eyes of an American. And I keep asking people, can you think of another country that has more of a direct daily impact on your life than Mexico? Whether you're American of Mexican descent, or an American, or Asian, or black, I mean African American, whatever you are, Mexico is there. It's a 2,000-mile border, and it has this continuous daily impact. And Mexico is not going anywhere. So I hope that by people, with people reading this book, they find a bridge of understanding, and they walk away and think, okay, I understand where this country is going. It's not all gloom and doom, but there's actually a possibility that someday Mexico will become a prosperous country. And imagine that. What would happen if suddenly you had a prosperous Mexico? I mean, that would just, I think, change the whole dynamic of who we are.
And so what is next for you? I mean, you continue to go back to Mexico and report. Does that mean you feel safe? And what are you going to write about?
Well, it doesn't mean that I have a death wish. I mean, I don't have a death wish. I find it that the story is still very important. I think I've learned a lot in the last few years, that it's security, safety. I think I have protection a lot of my colleagues in Mexico lack, because I have a U.S. passport, because I have a U.S. company. Not that that guarantees my safety or my security, but I want to believe, knock on wood, that something was to happen, there would be consequences. And I think we have a responsibility as American journalists to tell those stories, to remind people that 100,000 people have been killed or disappeared. And these people cannot be forgotten. So I take it as a responsibility, but I've also learned that if I'm going through the same thing, I don't know that I would stick it out like I have. I want to believe that the book will offer some kind of protection, and that I can remain. Mexico remains my love in many ways, and I like to stay there as long as I can.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Alfredo Corchado, for coming on our show. This has been Fronteras, A Changing America. I'm Monica Ortiz Uribe. Until next time.